Hello, I'm Ryan, and welcome to my channel, Analyze This Mr. Bond, where I discuss the adventures of James Bond 007 and dig for what lies beneath the surface. Today, we have plenty to dig into because we're digging into Live and Let Die, the second Ian Fleming James Bond novel. First and foremost, what a wonderful title. Live and Let Die is probably my favorite Bond title. It just has the perfect ring to it. And it has that sort of pulpy tang that so wonderfully reflects what is a very colorful and vibrant novel. But the flip side of this book is that it's also a very thorny book to talk about because Live and Let Die embodies the worst and best of Ian Fleming. It is a book deeply embedded in the troublesome aspects of Fleming's attitudes about culture and society. And they're not simplistic attitudes. Ian Fleming's writing here is complex. He is a man of his time, and I say that not to excuse him, but just to say that the impulses in this story are not clear cut. There's a lot of very bothersome material in Live and Let Die that would fail the if I was taking a road trip, would I put on the audiobook of the original text of this book with my friend in the car with no context? No, that would be a pretty awkward drive. All you have to do is just look at the chapter listing for Live and Let Die to raise an eyebrow. This is very much a product of its time. But I am a passionate fan of the pulp storytelling of the 20th century, whether we're talking about horror or crime or even romance novels of the period. And the reason I love pulp storytelling is because it's so primal, it's so instinctual. Generally, pulp is seen as what is called low art as opposed to high art. High art is, the culture that gets put on the ivory pedestal. It is the Citizen Kanes and the James Joyces and everything that the Academy celebrates. Whereas pulp is lurid and, was sold as dime store novels in its time. These were novels of the people that pandered to the interest in just raw, lurid storytelling full of violence and desire and steeped in the anxieties of the time. And that's why I actually love pulp storytelling, because I think pulp storytelling is in many ways a more honest form of storytelling about the human experience. It embodies what we really feel and think and daydream about in a way that some of our more quote unquote noble art obscures. Our noble art is what we aspire to, but pulp is what we are. And in pulp, you get some of the most exciting, vital, vibrant moments in storytelling that you'll find anywhere. That is one reason it's so exciting to read something like Live and Let Die. These conceits are so vivid and strong and dramatic and bold. But you also tend to get the other side of that, which is because it pushes to those extremes, it tends to pull out a lot of the less savory, the less sanitized, the less noble aspects of human consciousness. And so it is for Ian Fleming. Ian Fleming is a complex individual, and his writing is a very complex project. Some of his Bond books, which we'll get to, skew away from pulp towards more literary ambitions. Live and Let Die, I would say, falls more firmly in the pulp side of the spectrum, even more so than Casino Royale. It just feels baked into that sort of pulpy territory. In many ways, it feels like the equivalent to Casino Royale of what Temple of Doom is to Raiders of the Lost Ark. Raiders of the Lost Ark takes pulp serials and elevates them and makes them very elegant and thrilling, and then Temple of Doom comes along and you get this very lurid, dark, kind of nasty adventure with people's hearts getting ripped out of their chest. Live and Let Die isn't quite as tonally frantic as something like Temple of Doom, but it leans into that lurid aspect. In fact, it leans into the same kind of horror and adventure categories that I associate with Indiana Jones, which is why my mind goes there. This is a story about Bond hunting down pirate treasure. Pirate treasure in Live and Let Die is being used to fund the Soviet machine. The same Soviet machine that Bond, at the end of Casino Royale, has committed himself to destroy. In Casino Royale, Bond has his heart broken by his first love, Vesper Lind, and then sets out to destroy the machine that turned a young girl into a weapon. And here we find Bond embarking on that crusade. And like Casino Royale, Bond is going to find himself tested by it. There is this sense in the Fleming novels that Fleming is always putting Bond through the ringer. This is something that doesn't really come through in the movies as strongly, but in the books, Bond generally emerges from these stories pretty worse from wear at the end of it. There is a sense in which it's almost like the Die Hard John McClane trajectory, where by the end of Die Hard, John McClane is barely standing. In a lot of the Fleming novels, Bond is in pretty terrible physical shape by the end of the story. And in Live and Let Die, that is true, but it is also equally true that he is going to have more emotional scarring as a result of this adventure. Bond is introduced into the book as experiencing the sort of luxury of entering the United States for the first time on a kind of cushy path. He's been sent over to America to collaborate with them and is being given essentially red carpet treatment as he enters America. And the book is actually fairly slow to start. I think one of the weaknesses compared to Casino Royale of Live and Let Die is that it's very front-loaded with a lot of exposition and not a lot of excitement. And Casino Royale had a lot of exposition to start, but Live and Let Die is mostly just Bond having fairly dry conversations with individuals in hotel rooms and things like that for a while before the story kicks into gear in earnest and Bond really starts to come face to face with his enemy, Mr. Big, who is a very threatening enemy in this book. In many ways, he's a more intimidating foe than Le Chiffre was in Casino Royale. There is a lot of ambivalence that Bond has to American culture. In fact, Bond has to Americanize himself in this story, and that's one of the more amusing aspects of that Bond actually has to adopt a sort of American disguise here. And you get a real sense of Fleming's feeling for what American culture is and the distinction between Bond's Britishness and the Americanness that he has to put on as a disguise. And we see, of course, Bond's friendship with Felix Leiter return here. Felix Leiter was kind of an ancillary character in Casino Royale and is a much more major component of Live and Let Die, with a very tragic arc over this story. If you're familiar with what happens to Felix Leiter in this story, we'll talk about that in a bit. But there's this strong sense of Bond and culture here. And again, Fleming's Bond is a really passionate foodie. So you get some really interesting pieces in this book about, Bond enjoying the food but having like reservations about a butterscotch sauce and different things as he's entering into this American red carpet experience at the hands of his CIA counterparts. That all is pretty enjoyable, but what is actually the more interesting hook is his conversation with M and this dangling MacGuffin of the pirate treasure that is being used to fund the Soviet machine. This is the kind of story element that I really wish the movies would use. I know that an early draft of Quantum of Solace mapped this concept onto Iranian artifact smuggling, and I think it's a ripe idea for rediscovery because it adds such wonderful color here. It's such a wonderful setup, and it leads to such a tremendous climax with Bond and Mr. Big and Solitaire all together with the pirate treasure wrapped around them. It feels like almost something out of the Pirates of the Caribbean franchise with this grand climax, but it's so rich and atmospheric, and it's really pulling Bond out of his element. That is one aspect of this story that is pretty consistent from start to finish, is that Bond has really been pulled out of a place where he knows the game. Initially, Bond is yanked out of Britain into America and has to play by American rules, and then that gets even more complicated as Bond starts to investigate Mr. Big, this sort of dramatic figure who is running this sort of complicated underground network on behalf of the Soviet machine, but is also just an aspiring master criminal. Bond's conflict with Mr. Big really drives this book, and so we have to talk about Mr. Big a little bit here. Mr. Big is one of the complicated aspects of this book in terms of the way that he embodies this tension between, white and black identities in the story. He is presented as this embodiment of black achievement after emancipation, that as black people have begun to achieve great things, they are equally achieving great acts of criminality, that this pairing of great artistic achievement and great scientific achievement gets paired with this darker side, and Mr. Big is the embodiment of that. And with that, he is pulled over these aspects of culture that were suppressed in colonialism, these aspects of voodoo that he is using to propel himself to power in a more sanitized age. He is using this sort of underground layer of experience, this sort of subculture that has been kept out of sight by the mainstream of white culture to build an empire. And that's an element that is equally clear in the Live and Let Die movie as it is in this book. But what's really interesting is how strong Fleming is in pushing the element that Bond is really feeling anxiety about being out of his depth here. There's great passages with Bond reading about voodoo and finding himself really thrown by its power. And in that way, Mr. Big becomes a more compelling and threatening figure for Bond than Le Chiffre did, because he's really putting Bond on his back foot. In Casino Royale, Bond really seemed to be cocky. He really felt like he knew what the lay of the land was. In Live and Let Die, Bond is similarly pretty cocky. Bond's arrogance and hubris is kind of a core component of the Fleming Bond character. This idea that Bond is going to be reckless and pay some price for it is in many ways part of the Fleming Bond formula. But here, Bond is pretty anxious about what he's doing, and that anxiety kind of builds throughout the story. At first, it's about Mr. Big and his criminal enterprises and the way it's ensconced into this sort of voodoo culture that Bond doesn't understand, and Bond trying to find his way into that through his own recklessness. And then in the back half of this book, it becomes a story about Bond against nature. Man against nature is one of the great literary themes, and Fleming plays with that a lot with Bond. It's one of the aspects that you get to see in the earlier movies that stay closer to the Fleming books. You see things like, Bond encountering the tarantula in the Dr. No film and things like that. But Fleming leans much more on this idea of man versus nature as a strong theme in these books. And there is a great deal of attention and time put into Bond learning how to navigate the waters of Jamaica, these dangerous territory with barracuda and other wildlife that he just needs to understand at a really base level in order to be able to achieve what he sets out to achieve. There's a lot of Bond just kind of researching nature in this book, just reading books about wildlife. It's the kind of thing that would be not very cinematic in a movie. We wouldn't just want to see Bond in the corner reading a wildlife guide, but really in a book, it emphasizes just how much Bond is feeling a little bit alien here. So the character of Quarrel, who's very important in this book as Bond's local guide, is an expert in these territories. And you kind of get this sense that Bond comes to really appreciate the expertise that Quarrel represents as a local Jamaican expert in helping Bond overcome the threat of the natural hazards of this territory that Bond hasn't really encountered before. And that all builds to this very thrilling, dramatic climax where Bond navigates these waters to infiltrate Mr. Big's central operations where he is packing up the gold. And in a final big dramatic twist of fate, Mr. Big is actually destroyed by those same natural elements. Bond overcomes them through the force of luck, but the villain is destroyed in many ways by his own hubris, his own self-assuredness that he has such unfettered domination over the world that he's created. Mr. Big is devoured alive memorably. And that is a further poetic justice moment because Bond is humbled again through this story. Bond was humbled in Casino Royale. He was brought to his knees. His physique was battered and just nearly broken by Le Chiffre so much that it just shook Bond's confidence to his core. Here, Bond's ally takes the brunt of it. He becomes the sacrificial lamb. Felix Leiter is mauled. If you've seen the film License to Kill, where Felix Leiter is essentially mauled by a shark, that element comes straight from Live and Let Die here. And in many ways, Live and Let Die handles that better than License to Kill does. It uses it as an inciting element towards the climax of the story, as opposed to the start of the story, the way License to Kill uses it. And it really sets a lot of momentum going into the grand climax of Live and Let Die. So, as within any book, you have these three core elements. We've talked a little bit about Mr. Big, who is this dark, intimidating, and intelligent figure who embodies some of the more thorny tensions of Ian Fleming's own cultural ideas, but is nevertheless a pretty striking character in the way that he is using voodoo to kind of hold an entire organization in his thrall, including the Bond girl here, Solitaire. Solitaire is a woman who, has some level of psychic sensibility. It's not as exaggerated as it is in the film adaptation of Live and Let Die, but some level of heightened sensitivity to the events in the world, who directly reaches out to James Bond because she is trapped in Mr. Big's control and sees, when Bond kind of bluffs his way into Mr. Big's world, an opportunity for Bond to help her escape. And so she really kind of reaches out to Bond in their initial encounter and pursues him as her way out of this dark world that she's found herself trapped in. It's an interesting dynamic, but I think compared to Vesper, Solitaire feels like a fairly underdeveloped character that leans a little bit too much on some of the, basic pulpy tropes. The way she gets Bond's attention in their initial meeting is a little bit more crassly seductive than tender, and her background doesn't have the vivid complexity that some of the later Fleming heroines will have, like Tiffany Case or Domino. We'll talk about those when we get to those novels, but these damsel in distress figures bring out a really interesting sort of paternalism in James Bond, this sort of protective instinct. As much as I somewhat enjoy their sort of complex dynamic together as they're getting to know each other, they're being a little bit more flirty, a little bit more friendly in their dynamic, she really feels like a sort of ancillary character compared to what Felix Leiter is in this story. Felix Leiter is the real dramatic crux of Live and Let Die, whereas Solitaire, her arc and Felix Leiter's arc don't quite sit perfectly well together because it just kind of splits Bond's goal. Is Bond's goal to get revenge for his friend, or is Bond's goal to free the girl? I would say the elements of this story, this sense of the girl being a fortune teller and the sort of voodoo theatrics being used to run a criminal organization and pirate treasure, those elements are exactly the kinds of things that make Fleming's writing so striking. It just has a lot of color and a vibrancy about it. And it's a very sweaty, hot, intense novel with a sort of feverish anxiety driving the book once it starts to get going. Like I said, the first third of the book is a little bit slow and dry, but once it really starts to get going and Bond has his first encounter with Mr. Big that doesn't really go well for Bond, this book starts to develop a sort of feverish intensity that speaks to all the aspects in which I love pulp. That said, I find my feelings about this book a little bit conflicted because I think some of the passages in this book, as much as I've said, I tend to maintain this productive cognitive dissonance about art from the past. Art can be simultaneously many things, and Live and Let Die is simultaneously many things. I do find some of the troublesome passages in this book really tough to get through in a way that kind of sabotages my escapist drive. And that's not a judgment for anyone where that's not the case. That's just an expression of my personal experience with this. I would say Live and Let Die is ultimately one of my least favorite Ian Fleming books to read for all of the complexities in it. This is probably my third or fourth time reading this book, and I've always read the unvarnished versions. I have no interest in a sanitized version of Live and Let Die. I think if you're going to read Live and Let Die, you really should seek out the true unvarnished nature of it, the one that represents what Fleming the man wrote in all of its thorniness. But I would say it's just there's a slight bitter aftertaste with Live and Let Die that I haven't been able to quite square the way I have with some of the other Bond novels, which I think are a bit more purely satisfying, including its successor, which I am very excited to talk about, Moonraker, which is one of my absolute favorite Ian Fleming adventures. I think that one just works so well. So when we get to Moonraker, I'm going to have a really fun time talking about that one. So do let me know what you think about this book. I know so many of you love it, and by all means, I want you to keep on enjoying what you find enjoyable here, and I will catch you in the next one.